They said the billionaire had no heart, that he fired people without blinking, that he slept alone in a house so large it echoed when he walked through it, that nothing and no one could soften him. But on this night, in his own mansion, the most powerful man in the room dropped to his knees. Not for money, not for power, not for applause, but for a ring, a small crooked ring made of copper wire with a piece of broken sea glass in the middle. And as his fingers closed around it, the promise he made as a poor orphan boy came crashing back. "When I grow up, I'll marry you." Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because this story is not about wealth, it's about what survives when everything else is taken away. How did a billionaire lose the only person who ever believed in him? Why did a quiet maid wear a ring that held more value than diamonds? And what happens when a promise made by two forgotten children refuses to die? Stay with this story until the end, because the truth doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives when you're finally ready to hear it. Before the private jets, before the headlines, before the cold reputation, there was a boy named Sterling, 12 years old, too thin, too angry, too smart for his own survival. Mercy House Children's Home in Portland, Oregon. A place that smelled like bleach and boiled vegetables. A place where dreams learned to stay quiet. Sterling learned early that kindness was temporary, that promises were dangerous, that caring made you weak. The counselors rotated every few months, always with the same tired eyes and rehearsed smiles. The other kids formed alliances that shifted like sand. Sterling watched it all from the corner of the common room, his jaw tight, his hands always fidgeting with whatever he could find. Screws, bottle caps, pieces of wire. He built things because building meant control, and control was the only currency that mattered in a place where you owned nothing, not even your own future. And then there was Willa, 2 years younger, crooked braids, hand-me-down dresses, eyes that noticed everything. Where Sterling built walls, Willa built belief. She sat beside him when others avoided him. She listened when he spoke about becoming rich, not for greed, but for escape. The first time she approached him, Sterling was hunched over a broken radio in the corner of the recreation room. Everyone else was watching an old movie on the community television, but Sterling had no interest in fantasies. He wanted to understand how things worked, how they could be fixed or repurposed. Willa walked up with her hands behind her back, her worn sneakers making soft squeaks on the linoleum floor. "What are you making?" she asked. Sterling didn't look up. "Nothing you'd understand." She didn't leave. Instead, she sat down cross-legged beside him, close enough that he could smell the generic shampoo they all used. "Try me," she said, and something in her voice, something genuine and unafraid, made Sterling pause. He glanced at her, really looked at her for the first time. Her eyes were bright despite the dimness of the room, curious without being intrusive. "I'm trying to see if I can make a speaker work without the original wiring," he said quietly. Willa nodded slowly, studying the tangle of colored wires and metal pieces. "Can you?" Sterling shrugged. "Maybe, if I can find the right gauge wire." She smiled then, a small, knowing smile. "You will." And somehow, her certainty felt like a fact. Over the following weeks, Willa became Sterling's shadow, though he'd never admit he wanted her there. She asked questions that forced him to explain his thinking, which made his ideas sharper. She brought him things she found, bits of metal, old batteries, scraps of fabric that could be used as insulation. One afternoon, behind the orphanage among rusted metal and broken things, Sterling tried to make something beautiful. He had been thinking about it for days, ever since Willa mentioned her birthday was coming up. The orphanage didn't celebrate birthdays. Not really. There might be an extra cookie at dinner if you were lucky, but that was it. Sterling wanted to give her something that mattered, something that couldn't be taken away or forgotten. He sat on an overturned crate, a piece of copper wire in his hands, trying to twist it into a circle. His fingers were clumsy with intention, and the wire kept kinking in the wrong places. It was ugly, twisted, wrong. Until Willa appeared beside him, silent as always, and placed a piece of sea glass in his palm. "Put this in the middle," she said. "It's the color of your eyes." Sterling stared at the glass, a pale blue-green that caught the late afternoon light. He didn't know where she'd found it, probably during one of the rare field trips to the coast. He didn't ask. He just worked the wire around the glass, creating a rough setting that held it in place. When he finished, it was still imperfect, but it was something. He handed it to Willa, and she slipped it onto her finger immediately, her face glowing with something Sterling couldn't name. "It's perfect," she whispered. Sterling looked away. his throat tight. "It's just wire and glass." Willa shook her head. "It's a promise." And before Sterling could ask what she meant, she said the words that would echo through the rest of his life. "When you grow up and become rich like you say you will, you'll come back for me, and we'll get married, right?" Sterling was 12 years old, too young to understand love but old enough to understand loyalty. He nodded. "Right." Willa twisted the ring on her finger, her smile soft and certain. "Then, I'll wait. Life doesn't ask children if they're ready." 3 months later, Willa was gone. Sterling woke up one morning to find her bed stripped, her few belongings cleared out. No goodbye, no explanation. He cornered Mrs. Halverson, the head counselor, in the hallway before breakfast. "Where's Willa?" His voice was sharp, demanding. Mrs. Halverson barely looked up from her clipboard. She was placed with a family. "You should be happy for her, Sterling." But Sterling wasn't happy. He was hollow. He searched for her name in the records he wasn't supposed to access, asked questions that earned him punishment, wrote letters to the state agency that were never answered. Willa had vanished into the system, and Sterling learned what the world does best. It separates people and calls it order. The anger that had always simmered beneath Sterling's surface turned into fuel. He stopped building trinkets and started building plans. He studied harder, worked longer, spoke less. When he aged out of the system at 18, he had a full scholarship to a state university and a singular focus. He would become exactly what he said he would: powerful, untouchable, rich enough that no one could ever take anything from him again. And he did. By 25, Sterling had his first patent. By 30, his first company. By 35, his first billion. He moved through the world like a machine, efficient and cold. The media called him ruthless. His competitors called him brilliant. His employees called him sir and avoided eye contact. Sterling lived in a mansion on the cliffs outside Portland, a sprawling glass and steel structure that overlooked the ocean. It was beautiful in the way museums are beautiful. Impressive, but untouchable. He walked through it alone most nights, his footsteps echoing on marble floors, and felt nothing, or told himself he felt nothing. But some nights, when the fog rolled in thick and the ocean roared below, Sterling would stand at the window and wonder. He never looked for Willa. He told himself it was because she'd moved on, built a life, forgotten the strange boy who gave her a twisted wire ring. He told himself it was better that way. But the truth was simpler and more painful. He was afraid. Afraid that if he found her, she wouldn't remember. Afraid that if she did remember, she wouldn't care. Afraid that the one promise he'd ever made, the one thing he'd carried through all the years of building and breaking and becoming, would turn out to be as worthless as everything else. 23 years after Willa disappeared from Mercy House, a woman walked into Sterling's mansion. She was hired through the staffing agency Sterling's assistant used for household employees. Her name, according to the paperwork, was Lila Monroe. She was 33 years old, references impeccable, background check clean. She was assigned to the evening shift, the hours when Sterling was usually home but preferred not to be disturbed. Lila was perfect for the role. Silent, invisible, efficient. She moved through the house like a whisper, straightening books Sterling never read, fluffing pillows he never sat against, polishing silver he never used. Sterling barely registered her presence at first. She was just another face in the rotation of people who kept his life running smoothly. But then small things began to change. The lights in the hallways were softer, warm instead of the harsh white he'd grown accustomed to. The thermostat was adjusted to a temperature that actually felt comfortable instead of the cold he'd thought he preferred. Music played faintly from the kitchen in the evenings, old jazz standards that Sterling hadn't heard since he was young. He noticed, but he didn't say anything. He told himself it didn't matter. Until, one night, Sterling came home late from a board meeting, exhausted and irritated. He dropped his briefcase in the foyer and headed toward the stairs, ready to shut himself in his study with a glass of scotch in silence. But he stopped. There was a smell. Not cleaning products or the neutral scent of expensive candles his decorator insisted on. It was food. Real food. Garlic and butter and something baking. Sterling followed the scent to the kitchen, a room he rarely entered. Lila was there, her back to him, pulling a dish from the oven. She wore the standard uniform, simple black pants, and a white button-down, but her sleeves were rolled up, and there was a dusting of flour on her forearm. She set the dish on the counter and turned, startled to see Sterling standing in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sterling saw her clearly then, really saw her. Dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, no makeup, tired eyes that held something he couldn't quite name, and on her left hand, fourth finger, a ring. Copper wire, twisted and imperfect, with a piece of sea glass in the middle. Sterling's heart stopped. His mouth went dry. He stared at the ring, then at her face, and the world tilted. Lila's expression didn't change. She wiped her hands on a towel, her movements calm and deliberate. "I made extra," she said quietly, "in case you were hungry." Sterling couldn't speak. His mind was racing, calculating, rejecting, accepting. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be, but the ring was impossible to mistake. Lila turned back to the counter, plating the food with steady hands. "You should eat before it gets cold," she said, and her voice was different now, softer, tinged with something that might have been sadness or hope, or both. Sterling forced himself to move, to walk to the counter, to sit on one of the stools he'd never used. Lila placed the plate in front of him. Chicken, roasted vegetables, bread that steamed when he tore it open. It looked like home, though Sterling had never had a home to compare it to. He picked up his fork, but he couldn't take his eyes off the ring. "Where did you get that?" he asked, and his voice was rough, unsteady. Lila glanced at her hand at the ring, and something flickered across her face. "Someone made it for me," she said. "A long time ago." Sterling's hands were shaking. He set the fork down and stood abruptly, the stool scraping against the tile. Willa. The name came out like a prayer, like a curse, like a question he'd been asking for 23 years. Lila, Willa, whoever she was, met his eyes, and for the first time since she'd walked into his house, she smiled. Not a polite smile, not the neutral expression she wore like armor. A real smile, small and sad and achingly familiar. "Hi, Sterling," she said. And just like that, the billionaire disappeared. Only the orphan remained. Sterling didn't know he was crying until he felt the tears on his face. He couldn't remember the last time he'd cried, couldn't remember if he ever had, but standing in his massive, empty kitchen, face to face with the girl who'd believed in him when he was nothing, Sterling broke. "Why didn't you find me?" The words came out harsh, accusatory, but Willa didn't flinch. She leaned against the counter, her arms crossed, the ring catching the light. "I tried," she said simply. "When I was 18, I went back to Mercy House. They said you'd left for college, but they wouldn't give me any information. I looked for you online, but Sterling Vance is a common enough name, and I didn't know you'd changed it legally. I saw articles about you years later, saw your picture. I wasn't sure at first, you looked so different. But then I saw an interview where you talked about growing up in foster care, and I knew." Sterling's chest felt tight. "So you just showed up here? As a maid?" Willa shrugged. "I needed to see if you'd remember. If it mattered." Sterling stared at her, incredulous. "If it mattered? Willa, I've thought about you every single day for 23 years. I built all of this." He gestured wildly at the house. "At everything. Because of a promise I made to a 10-year-old girl behind an orphanage. How could you think it didn't matter?" Willa's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "Because people change, Sterling. You became someone important, someone powerful. I'm just a woman who cleans houses for a living. I needed to know if the boy I knew was still in there somewhere, or if he'd been replaced by someone who wouldn't even see me." The words hit Sterling like a physical blow. He thought about the past few weeks, about how he'd barely acknowledged her presence, how he'd walked past her in hallways without a second glance. She was right. He hadn't seen her. He'd become exactly what he'd sworn he'd never be, someone who looked through people instead of at them. Sterling sat back down, his legs suddenly weak. "I'm sorry," he said, and the apology felt enormous, inadequate. "I'm sorry I didn't find you. I'm sorry I stopped looking. I'm sorry I became this." Willa moved around the counter and sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "You're not just this," she said quietly. "You're also the boy who made me a ring out of trash and told me I mattered. That boy is still in there, Sterling. I've seen him these past few weeks. In the way you leave books open to pages you want to remember. In the way you stand at the window and watch the ocean. In the way you keep that old radio on your desk. The one from Mercy House." Sterling's head snapped toward her. "How did you know about the radio?" Willa smiled. "Because I'm the one who found the wire you needed to fix it. Don't you remember? You got it working the day before I left." Sterling did remember. He'd kept that radio for 23 years, moved it from dorm room to apartment to office to mansion. He told himself it was because he liked fixing things, but that was a lie. He kept it because it was proof. Proof that he'd once had someone who believed in him. Proof that he'd once been worth believing in. They sat in silence for a long time, the cooling food between them forgotten. Finally, Sterling spoke. "Why did you come back now? Why not years ago?" Willa was quiet for a moment, her fingers twisting the copper ring. "Because I needed to become someone first. When they took me from Mercy House, I was placed with a family in Seattle. They were kind but distant. I aged out, worked my way through community college, moved from job to job. I got married once, to a man who seemed stable. It lasted 2 years. I realized I'd said yes because I was tired of being alone, not because I loved him. After the divorce, I spent a long time figuring out who I was, without someone else defining me. I needed to be whole on my own before I could see if what we had was real or just two scared kids making promises they couldn't keep." Sterling understood. He'd spent 23 years building an empire, but he'd never built himself. He'd become successful, powerful, influential. But he'd never become happy. "Is it real?" he asked, and his voice was barely a whisper. Willa turned to look at him. Really look at him, and Sterling felt seen in a way he hadn't since he was 12 years old. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I'd like to find out." Sterling felt something crack open in his chest, something he'd kept locked and buried for so long he'd forgotten it existed. Hope. Over the following weeks, Sterling and Willa began the strange, tentative process of rediscovering each other. Willa stopped pretending to be just a maid, and Sterling stopped pretending he didn't need her there. They talked late into the night, filling in the gaps of 23 years. Willa told him about the foster family, about her failed marriage, about the 3 years she'd spent working at a bookstore in Eugene before finally deciding to come find him. Sterling told her about college, about the brutal early years of building his company, about the loneliness that had become so constant he'd stopped recognizing it as loneliness. They were different people now, shaped by time and experience and loss. But underneath it all, something essential remained. The way Willa tilted her head when she was really listening. The way Sterling's hands moved when he was explaining something he cared about. The way they could sit in comfortable silence, simply existing in the same space, and feel less alone. But not everything was easy. Sterling's world was complicated, full of obligations and expectations and people who wanted things from him. He had a gala coming up, a fundraiser for a children's charity he'd founded years ago. It was ironic he built an entire organization dedicated to helping kids in foster care, but he'd done it from a distance, writing checks and attending board meetings, never actually connecting with the children themselves. Willa offered to stay home the night of the gala, but Sterling refused. "Come with me," he said. Willa looked uncertain. "As what? Your maid?" Sterling felt the words like a slap, deserved but painful. "As my guest. As Willa. As the person who matters more to me than anyone in that entire room." Willa searched his face, looking for something. Whatever she found must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. "Okay." The night of the gala, Sterling stood in his bedroom adjusting his tie for the 3rd time. He was nervous, genuinely nervous, in a way he hadn't been since his first investor pitch. He heard a soft knock and turned to see Willa in the doorway. She wore a simple black dress, nothing expensive or flashy, but she looked beautiful, not because of the dress, but because she looked like herself. Confident, quiet, real. "You look terrified," she said with a small smile. Sterling laughed, a genuine sound that surprised him. "I am terrified. I've given keynote speeches to thousands of people, but the idea of walking into that room with you makes me want to run in the opposite direction." Willa walked over and reached up to straighten his already straight tie. "Why?" Sterling caught her hand, held it against his chest. "Because this matters. You matter. And I'm scared I'll mess it up." Willa's expression softened. "Then we'll mess it up together." They drove to the hotel in Sterling's car, a sleek black sedan that felt too formal, too cold. Sterling kept glancing at Willa, memorizing the way the city lights moved across her face. At the hotel, they walked through the lobby toward the ballroom. Sterling could hear the sound of the party, music, and laughter, and the clink of glasses. His chest tightened. This was his world, the world he built, but it had never felt more foreign. They entered the ballroom, and immediately people began gravitating towards Sterling. Business associates, board members, journalists. Everyone wanted a moment, a word, a photo. Sterling navigated it mechanically, his hand resting lightly on Willa's back, keeping her close. She was quiet, observing, and Sterling was grateful she didn't try to perform or pretend to be something she wasn't. Then Jonathan Cross appeared. Jonathan was on the board of Sterling's charity, Old Money, old attitudes, everything Sterling had learned to navigate but never learned to like. Jonathan's eyes swept over Willa with barely concealed disdain. "Sterling, good to see you. And who is this?" There was something in Jonathan's tone, something that made Sterling's jaw tighten. "This is Willa," Sterling said evenly. Jonathan's smile was thin, charming. "How did you two meet?" Before Sterling could answer, Willa spoke. "I work for him," she said simply. The silence that followed was sharp. Jonathan's eyebrows rose. "Oh, well, how modern of you, Sterling." The condescension was barely veiled, and Sterling felt anger flare hot and immediate. But before he could respond, someone else joined them. A woman Sterling vaguely recognized as a major donor. "Is that ring vintage?" the woman asked, gesturing to Willa's hand. Willa glanced down at the copper ring, still on her finger where it had been for 23 years. "No," she said quietly. "It's handmade." The woman leaned closer, her expression polite but curious. "How charming. Where did you get it?" Willa hesitated, and Sterling saw the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She was about to deflect, to minimize, to make herself smaller in this space that didn't feel like it was meant for her. Sterling couldn't let that happen. "I made it for her," he said, and his voice carried enough that several nearby conversations paused. "When we were kids. At Mercy House." The woman blinked, surprised. Jonathan looked confused. The entire dynamic of the conversation shifted. Sterling continued, his eyes on Willa. "We grew up in foster care together. Willa was the first person who ever believed I'd amount to anything. That ring is worth more to me than anything else I own." The words hung in the air. Willa's eyes filled with tears, and she looked at Sterling with an expression so raw, so full of emotion that Sterling forgot everyone else existed. And then Willa's hand trembled. The ring, worn thin by 23 years of constant wear, slipped from her finger. It hit the marble floor with a small, bright sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden quiet. Sterling moved without thinking. He dropped to his knees on the ballroom floor, his expensive suit forgotten, his reputation irrelevant. He found the ring near the leg of a table and picked it up carefully, cradling it in his palm like it was made of something precious. Which it was. When he looked up, dozens of people were staring. Jonathan looked scandalized. The donor looked confused, but Sterling didn't care. He rose to his feet and held the ring out to Willa. "May I?" he asked. Willa nodded, her hand shaking as she extended it toward him. Sterling slipped the ring back onto her finger, and as he did, he said the words he should have said 23 years ago. "I'm sorry I didn't come back for you sooner. I'm sorry I let the world make me into someone who almost forgot what matters, but I'm here now, if you'll still have me." Willa's tears spilled over, and she nodded, unable to speak. Sterling pulled her into his arms, holding her close, while the ballroom, full of Portland's elite, watched in stunned silence. He didn't care. Let them watch. Let them talk. Let them think whatever they wanted. For the first time in 23 years, Sterling Vance felt like himself. Jonathan cleared his throat awkwardly and walked away. The donor murmured something polite and drifted toward the bar. Slowly, the party resumed its rhythm, though Sterling could feel the whispers and glances following them. Willa pulled back slightly, wiping her eyes. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Sterling shook his head. "Yes, I did. I've spent 23 years building a life I thought would make me matter. But the only time I ever truly mattered was when I was with you. I'm done pretending otherwise." Willa smiled through her tears. "What does this mean, Sterling? Where do we go from here?" Sterling looked around the ballroom, at the wealth and power and influence he'd worked so hard to accumulate. Then he looked back at Willa, at the woman who'd worn a copper ring for 23 years because of a promise made by a 12-year-old boy. "Honestly, I have no idea," he said. "But I'd like to figure it out together." Willa's smile widened. "Together sounds good." They left the gala early, ignoring the surprised looks and whispered questions. Sterling drove them back to the cliffside mansion, but when they arrived, the house felt different, less like a museum and more like a place where people actually lived. Over the following days, Sterling made changes, not to the house, but to his life. He stepped back from the day-to-day operations of his company, appointing a CEO he trusted and moving into an advisory role. He restructured his charity, spending less time in boardrooms and more time actually meeting the kids the organization served. He visited Mercy House for the first time in over 20 years and funded a complete renovation, including a workshop where kids could learn to build and create, just like he had. And he spent time with Willa. Real time, not stolen moments between meetings or obligations. They took walks along the cliffs, cooked meals together in the too large kitchen, sat on the floor of Sterling's study, and sorted through boxes of his old things, including the radio from Mercy House. One evening, about 6 weeks after the gala, Sterling and Willa were sitting on the back terrace, watching the sun set over the ocean. The fog was rolling in, turning the world soft and gray. Willa was wearing one of Sterling's sweaters, too large on her frame, and the copper ring glinted in the fading light. "I've been thinking," Sterling said quietly. Willa glanced at him. "About?" Sterling reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. He opened it to reveal a ring, not a diamond, not something expensive or showy. It was platinum, simple and elegant, with a small piece of sea glass set in the center. The same color as the glass in Willa's copper ring. The same color as Sterling's eyes. "I had this made," Sterling said. "I wanted to give you something that would last, something that wouldn't fall apart or slip off. But only if you want it. Only if you think we're ready." Willa stared at the ring, then at Sterling, her eyes wide. "Sterling, are you asking me to marry you?" Sterling took a breath. "I made you a promise when I was 12 years old. I told you that when I grew up and became rich, I'd come back for you. It took me 23 years, and I did it backward. I became rich first and almost lost you in the process. But I'm here now, and I'm asking if you'll still have me, not because of who I became, but to spite it." Willa was quiet for a long moment, and Sterling felt his heart hammering in his chest. He'd faced hostile takeovers, brutal negotiations, financial collapses, but nothing had ever scared him like this moment. Finally, Willa spoke. "Do you remember what I said to you the day you gave me the first ring?" Sterling thought back, reaching through the years. "You said it was a promise." Willa nodded. "And I said I'd wait. I waited 23 years, Sterling. I waited through foster families and failed relationships and jobs that went nowhere. I waited because some part of me always believed you'd keep your promise. Not because you owed me anything, but because I believed in who you were, even when you stopped believing in yourself." She took the ring from the box, holding it up to catch the last rays of sunlight. "But I don't want to be the girl who waited anymore. I don't want to be someone you come back for out of obligation or guilt or nostalgia. If we do this, I need to know it's because you want me now, as I am, not as a memory of who I used to be." Sterling reached out and took her hand, the one still wearing the copper ring. "Willa, you're the only person who's ever made me feel like I'm more than what I've accomplished or accumulated. With you, I don't have to be Sterling Vance, billionaire CEO. I can just be Sterling, the kid who liked to build things, the man who still doesn't know how to navigate a room full of people, the person who's terrified of messing this up, but willing to try anyway. I don't want to marry a memory. I want to marry you." Willa's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she was smiling. "Then, yes. Yes, I'll marry you." Sterling slipped the platinum ring onto her finger, right next to the copper one. Willa didn't take the old ring off, and Sterling didn't ask her to. Both rings belonged there, one representing the promise they'd made as children, the other representing the choice they were making as adults. They were married 3 months later in a small ceremony on the cliffs behind Sterling's house. No guests, no fanfare, just a local officiant and the sound of the ocean below. Willa wore a simple white dress and both rings. Sterling wore a suit and the expression of a man who'd finally found his way home. After the ceremony, they sat on the terrace and watched the fog roll in, just like they had the night Sterling proposed. "What now?" Willa asked, her head resting on Sterling's shoulder. Sterling thought about the question. For 23 years, he'd been moving towards something, building towards some undefined goal. Now that he'd reached it, now that he had everything he'd ever actually wanted, the future felt wide open and uncertain. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe we figure it out as we go." Willa smiled. "Together?" Sterling kissed the top of her head. Always together. And for the first time in his entire life, Sterling Vance felt wealthy in a way that had nothing to do with money. So now we ask you, what would you have done if you were Sterling? Would you have gone back to find Willa? Or would you have convinced yourself that the past was better left buried? And what about Willa? Would you have waited 23 years for a promise made by a child? Or would you have moved on and built a different life? Do you believe some promises transcend time? Or do you think we hold on to the past because we're afraid of the present? Tell us in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of something or someone you've never forgotten, subscribe for more stories like this. Stories that don't just entertain, but live with you long after the screen goes dark. Because in our next video, you'll hear about a woman who kept a secret for 30 years until one knock at her door changed everything. Thank you for watching.